Okay, everybody. Good morning again. We'll keep this a little bit shorter, just looking at some of the features of moving into radical Republican Reconstruction. So the issue, once the president creates his version of Reconstruction, it's very, very loose on the South. There's a lot of outcry from the Republicans in Congress, and they're creating these pieces of legislation to ensure, greater equality for freed people, especially the 1866 Civil Rights Act. Also, something that will happen in 1866 is there's some congressional elections. It's an election year for members of the Senate and the House. That becomes significant too. Johnson does veto both of the bills that the radicals had come up with, and so they become in a position to try to override the president's vetoes. They're able to do this successfully and to pass those two pieces of legislation, continue the Freedmen's Bureau and have the Civil Rights Act. The reason they're able to do that is that there were a larger number of radical Republicans elected to office in 1866. The country's climate starts to change in terms of a push toward greater rights for freed people. That's mostly in the North. And the reason that changes is there's becoming increased violence in the South. In some places in particular, in Memphis, for example, there are places where former African Americans who were formerly in the in the Union military come to blows with white planters. There's times when African Americans get targeted, a huge race riot in New Orleans, for example, and this degree of violence kind of increases the understanding that the federal government needs to have some sort of policy to create rights for freed people. And the radicals have more weight in Congress by the end of 1866. And they start not only to create an override of the veto from Johnson, but they're also going to create a lot of their own legislation. And this is where we see radical Reconstruction. And so when we look at radical Reconstruction, this really means, Congress's version of Reconstruction. It begins in 1867, and it does get passed by Congress and does take place. So a few things to keep in mind is that the 14th Amendment, so the 13th Amendment was the first of the Reconstruction amendments that was really focused on eliminating slavery, ensuring that states would not be able to impose the institution of slavery. The 14th Amendment is going to offer a variety of different rights for freed people. One of them, and this is really significant, is the right of birthright citizenship, which is going to affect not only formerly enslaved persons, it's also going to affect, other Americans outside of Native Americans, but other Americans who are going to be considered as American citizens for the first time. And it creates a whole variety of opportunities for people to use the court system to suggest that they fit the definition. And this is something, the birthright citizenship thing, it's really different than what had been in place prior to the Civil Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. Citizenship was determined by states. So any state could decide if somebody was a citizen or not, and states could vary on that. So we take it for granted today that birthright citizenship is like just a part of the original Constitution. It isn't. And this is something that some historians say, with the 14th Amendment, we really get kind of the Constitution that we would recognize today as, maybe the revolutionary part of the Constitution. But it doesn't come about until 1868. And it actually, in reality, isn't going to be enforced for some time. The other part of this, constitutional guarantee for the rights and security of freed people, we'll look at the excerpts of the 14th Amendment in class tomorrow, but there's a section of it that describes equal protection under the laws, the idea that people who are, people can't be treated differently under the law. So Black Americans and white Americans have to receive the same punishments, the same treatment under the law. And that takes some of the Black codes and puts them, in the limelight that they could be violating the 14th Amendment. When we look at the document, you'll be able to see some of the significant details. Debts that are incurred by the South aren't going to be paid by the Union. So there's a lot of pieces and clauses to the 14th Amendment, but it does really create some opportunities for greater rights for free people, and the radical Republicans' intent is to include the 14th Amendment in what states have to take on and have to adhere to in an effort to come back into the Union. There will be also in the 14th Amendment, there is a clause that representation in southern states or any state could actually be limited if the state denied the right to vote for Black citizens. So this is kind of a little bit of a spot where the 14th Amendment compromises. Somebody like a Thaddeus Stevens, who was a radical Republican, really would have wanted there to be outright, suffrage for Black Americans, and ensuring that suffrage couldn't be prohibited. And ultimately, that's what happens in the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. This is a little bit more of a compromise. The right to vote can be limited under the 14th Amendment, but it enables then a punishment. There's less representation in Congress. And, something else just to remember, with the end of slavery, the 3/5 clause actually ends. And there's concern in the North that there's going to be larger numbers of people, 4 million people who were previously not, counted as full persons in terms of representation. So this punishment in the 14th Amendment, to target and limit representation is significant, because it's something that Northerners are concerned about, that the Southern states are going to have greater power as a result of the end of the 3/5 clause. But the last few things, and I'll mention this kind of quickly, and again, tomorrow we'll look at the Black Codes and we'll look at the 14th Amendment and kind of go back to this. But in the 1866 election, this really is a referendum on the radicals' version of Reconstruction. Johnson, the president, is going to go around the entire country to try to push his presidential Reconstruction and put down the radicals' Reconstruction. It's referred to as the swing around the circle. He's going to take, local trains, and he's going to move, around the country and largely give speeches, but he's very ineffective. He has a very local Kentucky form of, his, the way that he goes about his speeches. He is crude in some cases. He gets a lot of pushback, and his tour is not really well received. And not only do the Republicans win a majority in both houses, they're going to use this to be able to push, their version of Reconstruction. The key pieces of radical Reconstruction, which completely replaces Johnson's plan. So these are going to be new ways in which the South will have to come into the Union, and new ways that the southern states are going to be monitored. This is going to include military supervision. So there is actually a breaking up of the former Confederacy into military zones, and the Northerners are going to send Union forces to enforce some of Reconstruction. In reality, it's not a military event. There isn't a strong sense of military activity. But it does create a difference in the way in which the laws are going to get imposed. There will be new state constitutions, it's like all over again, including Black suffrage, ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Okay, the 15th Amendment had not yet been written. That becomes a really big issue because there had been a proposal by women's suffrage leaders to have not only voting for Black males, but also for women and Black males. And that gets rejected by a lot of individuals who are in favor of the 15th Amendment. And there is a breakup, in a sense, between these two groups that had been up until this point largely working together, women seeking the vote and African Americans who were men, seeking the vote. military actually is able to enroll Black voters. So there is going to be a whole bunch of constitutional conventions that are going to be held in 1867. But the votes now are not, the constitutions are not going to be created by, the former Confederates who are at the only people allowed in the state constitutional conventions. Now, Black voters are going to be able to not only participate in the vote, but also participate in holding office. And that includes designing the state's constitutions so that there can be much more fairness of, rights for free people. The intent of the radicals is to create an opportunity for Black citizens to get into the legislative bodies so that they can then have influence on the specific areas for each state, eliminate the Black codes and instead put in more rights. And that's the idea of radical Reconstruction. There's a variety of acts that go into Reconstruction, so I'm going to stop the video here, but you can see the map that just describes the very military districts that were created. So Arkansas and Mississippi under one military district, Texas and Louisiana under one military district, and the Congressional Reconstruction is organized with a few things that become really different. Not only does it enable Black Americans' participation in political office, and that's like a must in a sense for states to be eligible to have new state constitutions. And we do see quite a bit of Black participation. The other thing that becomes really significant is this arm of enforcement. There's a lot of attention paid to enforcement, which is going to be significant because, as you can imagine, if you had to predict what the reception is going to be for the radicals in in the South, this radical plan in the South is going to get a great deal of pushback, and it's at this moment where we see the development of the KKK and a great deal of violence toward African Americans in the South, and Reconstruction takes place, with that degree of violence. So I'm going to stop it there. Tomorrow we'll look at the 14th Amendment and the Mississippi version of the Black